it doesn't help the cause at all that what we highlight as our independence is independence from Haiti. So you automatically make them the other.
Mhm.
And they also happen to be Black, for the most part. That teach history a little different so that kids don't learn from the very beginning of school that we got our independence from our neighbors.
Yeah.
Rather, let's, let's talk about the reality that was 400, they freed us from 300 years of oppression from the Spanish. We got independence from Spain. Let's highlight those things. But, Spain is put on a pedestal.
This is the Moreish Podcast, where Caribbean history meets culture and cuisine. Welcome back to the Moreish Podcast. This is Hema. In today's episode, we're diving into the food, history, and culture of the Dominican Republic with Harry Alvarez. Harry was born in New York City, and at 6 months old, his family relocated back to their native home in the Dominican Republic. Ever since, he's lived in the cultural and physical space between the Dominican Republic and the United States. He currently resides in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, with his partner Lauren and 2 sons. Harry is the co-founder of Offbeat Travel, a destination management company who have been working in the area for over 15 years, and they believe in the power that tourism has to support the Caribbean communities. For them, keeping local people involved is key, and the mission of Offbeat Travel is to decolonize travel and create equity in the travel industry by ensuring the people in the places they visit have ownership of the design, implementation, management, and economic benefits of travel to their communities. With a personal and professional connection to the Dominican Republic, it felt like a natural fit to have Harry join me to share his thoughts on the country. Hi, Harry. How are you?
Good, good. How are you doing?
I'm great. I appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast and talk about the cuisine of the Dominican Republic. But before we get there, let's backtrack and talk about how we first met. I went to a women in travel conference and I met the team at Trova who introduced me to you.
Yeah, I am the co-founder and COO of a destination management company, in the Dominican Republic in Costa Rica. So we operate programming mostly for student travel companies and other travel brands to come down and we do all of their ground operations. So I'm based in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic.
And your company is called what?
Offbeat Travel.
Harry, when we first had a conversation, you talked to me about where you currently live, where you have lived. So let's set the stage for who you are.
Of course, of course. So I'm Dominican American. I was born in New York in Washington Heights, where a lot of Dominicans are, in the Heights, from the movie. And at 6 months old, my mom and dad decided to move back to the Dominican Republic. I had much older brothers. It was 1980s New York, the middle of the crack epidemic, and they just wanted to go back to the Caribbean. I lived here till I was in second grade, and then my brother wanted to go to college back in the States, so we moved back up to the Bronx. And from second grade through college, I was in New York, went to college in upstate New York. I was on the med school track. I was going to go to medical school. I was doing a program at Columbia and felt really depressed. And my older brother was like, "Hey man, my wife did programming when she was in college, where she went to go be basically like a camp counselor internationally." So I did that. I applied to work for a company called Rustic Pathways, and I went down to Costa Rica and led trip programming mostly with indigenous group. And I fell in love. I fell in love with travel. I realized that I had been traveling my whole life, going back and forth to the US and the DR, and that there's more than one way to help people. I wasn't going to be the next Toyota driving around Latin America like the motorcycle diaries, but there's other ways to do it that's being a factor. So all that, and then when I came back home, my mom was like, "Yo, that makes sense. You had been involved with youth group in your church growing up, and you were used to work at a teen center." And then it kind of all clicked in. So I worked in Costa Rica as a program leader guide for a couple of years and worked my way up that company. Eventually launched operations for them in the Dominican Republic, in Cuba, and Puerto Rico, and then was the director of operations at that company for a while. And then decided to spin off on my own and start providing experiences for more than one travel brand through my locally owned and operated destination management company, Offbeat.
You currently live in the Dominican Republic, or do you move and spend your time in the US and Dominican?
That's a good question. So I historically would spend like half my year here and half my year in another Caribbean city, which is New Orleans. But since the pandemic, we moved down here full time, kind of to get the business kind of back off the ground after COVID. We don't see ourselves moving out of here anytime soon. We're really enjoying living here in the Caribbean, living in Santo Domingo. Our kids are having a great time, and we've been down here full time for 3 years now.
So you have a really good rounded experience of the North American experience, the Caribbean Dominican experience, which I think is really going to be helpful in today's podcast episode. I'm going to go back to our initial conversation when we were first introduced and talking about what this podcast is all about, which is the history of the people of the Caribbean and how that influences current day culture and cuisine. And I said to you, we covered the Dominican Republic in season 1, and we talked about the indigenous population, which the Dominican Republic tourism website refers to as Taino Arawak, as the original inhabitants of the island as a whole. And you had a couple of things to say about that.
Yeah. So my entire life, I grew up being told that the indigenous people of the DR and parts of Cuba and Puerto Rico and what they call the Greater Antilles were the Tainos. But it wasn't until really recently, through just like having different experiences and researching, that I realized that wasn't the name they called themselves. That was the name that was given to them because that was one of the words they used. So when the colonizers arrived, they heard them saying this word and they're like, oh, so you keep working, but that's not what they called themselves, which I find really interesting. With indigenous culture in places like the Dominican Republic, the first place Columbus landed back in 1492. And within 50 years, so by 1550, there weren't any, they had been massacred through enslavement, through the exchange of diseases that they weren't used to. And there's actually historical sightings of also through like mass suicides, that just, being encountered with this new reality. So there's very little trait of that culture because we're talking about, 1550 to almost 500 years ago.
You said Taino is not how the indigenous people would have referred to themselves.
They were Arawak indigenous folks. They were coming up. It was the way that the island are populated, from what I understand. It was, everyone crossed the Bering Strait all the way down to South America, and then they actually came in from Venezuela, up the smaller islands to the bigger island.
Yeah.
To land in what is now Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica. Yeah.
All over the Caribbean, to many different islands.
Okay, yeah.
You mentioned Christopher Columbus, who was the first European to land on the island and spend any time there. So we have the Spanish, we have the indigenous population who did not initially get along. Who else and what other countries arrived on the island and colonized and took over?
Yeah, so it's interesting because you have the Dominican Republic and, one island that we know now has two countries. So originally, Christopher Columbus landed on the north coast. They found Santo Domingo later because it had a river, a natural port, easy to defend from pirates, from attacks. So they founded the city of Santo Domingo and the colony on the eastern side of the island, which was then called Santo Domingo, the entire eastern part. The western part of the island was not as visited. It was, not part of the big mountains of DR, which people don't realize. It's like treacherous terrain to cross. So what happened is, originally French buccaneer pirates started to set up shop on the western part. And you look at what is now the coast of Haiti, it's very kind of wavy. There's a lot of natural harbor from hurricanes, a really good spot to like, take up shop if you have boats. And then eventually the French came in on the west side of the island and set up their colony, which they call Saint Domingue. The difference between the two flags is the Spanish had come and brought a lot of Spanish folks. They kind of like were doing a bit of society building, whereas on the west side, the French were more treating it like a giant plantation. So it was mostly enslaved Africans. Over 80% of the population was enslaved African. So fast forward a couple hundred years of that system, at this point, you're talking about 1822, the Spanish have found way bigger riches in what is in Central and South America, like the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, and the DR was kind of like a forgotten colony, or Santo Domingo was. Saint Domingue was being treated like a big plantation. There was a major slave rebellion, which turned into a revolution. The Haitians got their independence from France. They're the first nation to get their independence from the colonial powers in the Americas after the American Revolution. Before all of South America, before Mexico, before anyone had independence from the colonial powers, Haiti had the first Black Republic. What happened is they also then take over the entire island, but that it's not really like a takeover, which is how it's taught in most classes here at the DR. Because again, it was a forgotten colony. It was a very poor place. They were like, hey, maybe these people will make it better. So for 22 years, the Haitians controlled the entire island. In my opinion, they made a couple errors, which was trying to make French the national language, going against the Catholic Church. Some things that are just culturally hard to accept when you like have spoken Spanish your whole life and that kind of stuff. So in 1844, the Haitian army had gone out to the west to go defend against an incoming armada from France, because France wasn't like, oh, I'm just going to go with my colony, which at that point was the richest colony in the world. Sugar was like gold back then. And in 1844, the DR kind of like takes advantage. The Haitians are gone. They declare independence from Haiti. They then annex themselves back to Spain, which is kind of like a really weird system, and then get their independence from Spain through the restoration of independence, or the Restauración. Unfortunately, like we're the independence that we really celebrate is the one from Haiti, not the one from Spain, which kind of leads, in my opinion, to that otherism of Haiti. But then Haiti has other history that goes after that, with like the French taxing them for independence and then not really allowing them to become an independent nation. But that goes into a whole other realm of history there.
That's a whole other history. And it's really interesting, as we covered Haiti and the Dominican Republic in season 1 of this podcast, how intertwined the history of the entire island is, and then how things changed and divided because there's so much more of a French influence in Haiti and so much more of a Spanish influence in the Dominican Republic, just based on all of the history that you laid out in a brief little nutshell. And so that brings me to talking about the current population. So according to what I've seen, it is around 11 million people, with about 70% being of mixed background. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, yeah, it would. I mean, and the thing about the Dominican Republic is that it's more similar demographically to like Brazil than it is to like Argentina or Chile. We have way more of a Black and former enslaved people's genetics in us than in a lot of other places. So I would say that yes, we're mostly mixed, and we have. When I did my DNA, it was like 30% West African, 30% like Iberian Peninsula, and then like a whole bunch of mix. Very little indigenous, but there was some like Taino, as they would say, in there. But it was, mostly West African and Spanish. Yeah.
So that brings us, Harry, to current day. We fast forward a few years, bring us to current day. Would you say the culture currently is more of a fusion of the African and Spanish influences, or is there something else there?
Yeah, I would say, there that would definitely get assessment. And then you mix in a little bit of things that people don't even realize come from indigenous too. So we eat a lot of cassava, for example, which is like yuca root, and we make cassava bread, and that traces itself way back to like the indigenous folks of the island. They were eating that here before that. But then you look at some of our other dishes, and it is kind of like a mix of like taking from here, taking from there. Dishes like sancocho, for example, or even mango. So sancocho is like our stew, which I like to use because it's like it really represents all of our mixes. Because you've got ingredients there. You've got the yams, you've got the squash based soup, which is very much from West Africa. But then you also have other ingredients that are coming from like Spanish influence, like the sofrito. That's kind of how they cook in Spain. And then you got the yuca in there as well, which is comes from our indigenous. So like there definitely the cuisine definitely has this mix of all.
So, for anybody that doesn't know what sancocho is, can you describe it?
Yeah. So sancocho properly done is you've got a giant pot. Like imagine the biggest pot you've ever seen and double it. And it's usually cooked over like a bonfire in the backyard or something. Because the pot's so big, it doesn't fit on the stove. My mom actually, when we lived in the Bronx, because obviously immigrants have to adjust to the realities of where they're living, she actually had found this like thing that would connect all four burners on our stove in the apartment so you can make a bigger pot of it. But it's a big dude. You start with the meat. So it's supposed to have 7 different types of meat in it to do it properly. So, they have chicken, and they have what we call gallina vieja, or like an older hen, basically, because the older chickens, you don't really eat them very often. Most of the chicken you eat at the store is very young. The older chickens are very muscly, but they have like a more broth stuff that's good for the broth. A guinea hen, which is something that comes from West Africa, which is a different type of chicken or fowl. Pork, beef, oxtail. You add water to that, and then you add squashes, which gives it like a thicker, like not pumpkin, but kind of like a type of squash. It's found with the art called auyama. And then you kind of cook that for like hours and hours until, and then you add in tubers, so potatoes, yuca. There's like a ton of different tubers. Tubers being things like potatoes and root vegetables that you add to it, and then always you got to add some plátanos to it too, because anything in that could like have plantains in it. And it's just big soup, and you usually eat it. So you got the big broth, the big soup. You get a big bowl full with like a little bit of rice, a piece of avocado on top, and you're golden. Big sugar.
That's so interesting because what it's reminiscent of to me is so many other Caribbean countries have a similar type of what I would just classify loosely as a stew, right? That is often made in a big pot, that is made communally, that has its roots in the times of slavery, right? When people had to come together and use whatever they could find, whatever they were allowed to create a big communal, very hearty meal.
100%, yeah. And I mentioned that I lived in New Orleans for a long time. You have the gumbo in New Orleans, which is very similar. Okra or molondrones, which is what is the base of gumbo versus squash in the Republic, also traces itself back to West Africa because the first cheese or okra came in the pockets of enslaved Africans that came over. And we eat okra here a lot too
Yeah.
in the Republic. So you see those connections there.
If someone were to ask you to just generally describe the food in the Dominican Republic, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so not spicy, first of all. A lot of people assume it's flavorful, but not spicy. So we actually don't have spicy culture here, which I struggle with because I love spicy food. But generally is we have what we call the bandera dominicana, or the Dominican flag, which is basically the dish that everyone eats on a regular basis. So it's a white rice, beans, some kind of meat, and some kind of salad. What varies here, what I love about the Dominican Republic, unlike other kind of Central American countries that mostly eat black beans, we have a huge variety of beans that we eat. We eat black beans, pinto beans, These ones that they call Jewish beans, they're like white, fava beans, lentil, guandules, which are also common in Puerto Rico. So I would say it's very rice, bean, meat based. Definitely very meat based. The beans are cooked for hours to get really good flavor in them.
Mhm.
A really well done Dominican food is cooked with natural ingredients. Then you have, well, you make a sofrito, which is like your original kind of like base, which is typically garlic, salt, some kind of citrus, either vinegar or lime. Oregano is a very important ingredient here. There's a lot of oregano that grows here in the DR, Dominican oregano. And that kind of forms the basis for like most dishes. And then from kind of tomato to give it some color. But I would say like very flavorful, like very, the beans are kind of on top of the rice, but it's not spicy, but it's, very rice and beans based.
You mentioned oregano that grows in the Dominican. Is that the same oregano that we would be using here in North America?
Yeah, it's a different variety. It smells a lot like it though. It's oregano. It's a type of oregano, but it's not Italian oregano, which is the one that we're used to eating in the States. There's also Cuban oregano, which is even thicker, but they have the same oregano smell. So just different varieties of the same herb. The other thing that we eat a lot that's oregano is goat, which I also trace. I mean, they eat a lot of goat in West Africa as well. We have a lot of desert in the DR. People don't realize a lot of areas are really arid. But goats are really good at finding water on their own and like not needing a lot of water. So they get a lot of goats on the border regions. Um, and that's also where the oregano go. They say the goats are good because the goats eat the oregano. They're already naturally seasoned.
I I have heard that. I've heard people say make sure you feed your goats some kind of herb so they're all naturally seasoned.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that, you have said it's not spicy. It's flavorful, but nowhere have you mentioned whether it's in the dishes or in the sofrito, any kind of hot peppers. So that's really interesting to me because there are so many Caribbean islands that heat and spice plays a role.
And there'll be like a little picante on the side for like Tabasco usually. And some people also do make like these vinaigrettes, like homemade vinaigrettes with Haiti tea, which is like a really spicy, almost like the ornamental peppers that we see back in the States.
Yeah.
They're really spicy. So people make those, but it's always like something you add to it. That usually something that's included by default. Yeah.
If we break down the dish where you just talked about, it is rice, some kind of bean, meat, and a salad. Many of these elements come from the time of colonization, right? That seems to me to have a very Spanish influence with the rice and the beans.
Yeah. Yeah. And I didn't realize that until I went to Spain for the first time in December. My wife actually studied abroad there. And we went to stay with her whole family, which is awesome that she still had that connection. I was surprised. I mean, I always knew there was paella, which is rice based. I always knew that there was, I didn't realize how strong the beans were there too, though. Like, bro, I had a lot of garbanzo dishes and yeah, like, I making those connections. The interesting thing about the rice too, though, is the rice is really like an Asian thing. But I think that another reason it's taken off so much in Latin America, like same as sugarcane, which is also from Asia, is because of the similar weather that we have. Like my family, we are rice farmers, so they grow a lot of rice here. So it's all domestic now, but it's not originally from here.
That one standard meal that you've talked about has influences from so many different places, but not the indigenous population.
Now, I mean, people will have cassava in the house always. It's so, and people will have cassava with any meal, because you can basically take the gravy from anything and put it on and eat it. But that's about it. And I don't think people realize even how, I don't think I didn't realize the connection to the indigenous until like recently. But growing up, I ate it, but I didn't realize that it was something that I've been around here for. We haven't talked about plátanos, plantains are like life here. So people could eat plantain breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm not even exaggerating. Like you make mangul for breakfast. So mangul, it's from what I've my research, it actually comes again from mashed plantain or mashed tuber dish from West Africa that had a similar name. But mango is basically our version of mashed potatoes. You take plantains, you boil them in hot water. You then take them out, drain them, mix butter and salt, and you mash them up. Serve that with some fried egg, some fried cheese, and some fried salami. And you that what we call los tres golpes, which is kind of like our typical breakfast, the three hits. It's not a high cholesterol breakfast. I don't recommend it every time, but it's delicious. But the people have mango for breakfast. Then at lunchtime, anytime you have the bandera dominicana, the rice beans, and you also usually have someone making tostones, which are like, you take the plantains, you cut them in slabs about this big, you fry them once, you smash them, and you fry them again, and you have those tostones or something they call patacones. If you have those are like our French fries. They dip them in ketchup. It's delicious. And then at dinner, you might have just boiled plantains with like piece of like fresh cheese or something. My mom will actually have plantains or yuca boiled, and she'll cut it into pieces and have it like cereal with milk. She says she grew up eating like that too.
In the Dominican Republic, you've been saying plantain. My family is Trinidadian, so we call it plantain. So it's one and the same. It's one and the same. We just pronounce it a little bit differently. Do you guys normally eat plantains when they're on the greener side or on the riper side?
Ooh, good question. Both. So all the stuff that I just mentioned was the green one, but then when they're ripe, you can make maduros, which is you cut them up and you fry them, but they're sweet. We also have a dish called pastelón de plátano maduro, which is like a lasagna of ripe plantains. So you literally pick all the ripe plantains, you mash them up, and you get a layer of them at the bottom, a layer of ground beef, and then another layer of that at the top, and then a layer of cheese on top, and that's like that. With the sweet plantains, it's like a Dominican lasagna.
That I've never heard of before. I'm gonna have to look that up and try it myself.
Yeah, it's really good. And then they also be serving dessert. You take like an entire really ripe plantain, and you stick a piece of cinnamon in it, or put cinnamon powder on it and put it in the oven, kind of like a banana foster almost. And you take it out, you serve it warm with some ice cream. It's delicious.
You referred to the plantain being used in the fashion that would have been used in West Africa. So the sort of the pounding of the grain plantain to make a dish. And that comes from the West African traditions of pounding, whether it's yams and in some places cassava, as it sort of moved over into the Caribbean regions. The enslaved people took the techniques that they were used to, using ingredients that they could find locally, and created new and unique dishes that we now eat all over the Caribbean.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we still eat the mashed yuca, the mashed plantains. There's a bunch of other tubers and yams that come in tons of variety that people do like that. It's the different purees. Definitely, it's still a big part of our culture here.
The techniques remain and created entirely new ways of eating based on the ingredients available in the Caribbean or that were
Yeah.
brought to the Caribbean. Are there other cultures that have influenced the cuisine and culture in the Dominican Republic? So we've talked about the indigenous, we've talked about the enslaved Africans, we've talked about Spanish, but are there other influences?
Yeah, there's different really interesting ones that people wouldn't like. For example, there's a huge Lebanese population here. The current president traces himself back to that Lebanese immigration. There's a big Lebanese country club not far from my house. So in Lebanon, they have the kibbeh, which is kind of like a bulgur wheat or falafel type thing. Here we have kibbehs, and there's street food, and it's the same kind of like outside masa, and they have like ground beef in the middle. I didn't realize until very recently that it wasn't just Dominican, but that was actually from this Lebanese influence, which I thought was really interesting. Up in the mountain in Constanza, it's now known as like Strawberry Central, but those strawberries are originally brought by Japanese immigrants that came up to the Dominican Republic and like have set up in Constanza. Obviously, we've got like influences from Haiti and some dishes that come over from Haiti as well. A lot of the goat the influencers, they eat a lot more goat in Haiti. Another interesting one is in the peninsula of Samana, you've got communities of Black folk that actually came, they were freed, enslaved folk from the US that were trying to go back to Africa and ended up in Chaminade. So you had the English speaking folks that ended up in Chaminade like in the 1800s. So you've got like collard greens, you got, some of the southern influence, southern, like what you would think of southern black food being consumed in those areas too, which is really interesting.
I love that we can trace people's movements and migrations around the world through food, right? And we can see the similarities, as you've mentioned a couple of times now, in New Orleans, for instance, right? And other places in the US. And we know that these similarities come because of the migration of people or the movement of people, whether it's forced migration or voluntary.
Yeah, yeah. Another good example of that is mofongo in Puerto Rico, which is basically like mango, just done a little differently. And you have these things that were like the same ingredients were put into the pot, the same culture and ingredients you put into the pot, but things develop very differently. But it's interesting to see those comparisons, and it's a beautiful thing. So one of the issues that we have, I personally have with DR, is like a not so much of an acceptance of the African roots. And we were working on that. Things are getting way better. My brother has dreads. When he first got dreads in '98, he would come down here and he'd be like, everyone would look at him like he was crazy. He could stop at custom. Now you see dreads all over the place here, which is awesome. So things are definitely heading in the right direction. But I always like to be cautious because while I do know we need to acknowledge our indigenous culture, sometimes it is weaponized as a way to not accept our African culture. So people are like, oh, well, I'm not black, I'm Indio. I'm like, well, sure, we're all of those things, but you have to accept them all. You can't like pick and choose.
When we were researching the history of Dominican Republic for the episode in season one, I came across the terms Indio, Mestizo, Mulatto, Moreno, and we also came across a book by Dr. April Mays who talks about the Mulatto Republic and the colorism and shadism that is really in play, and how people seem to want to identify as one thing to, I'm paraphrasing some of what I read through her book, want to identify more as Indigenous or European and white and less as African. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, 100%. Our cédulas until recently, which is our national ID here, said Indio. And, if you do any kind of genetic study, we find that while we do have indigenous roots, a minority of our DNA these days because of what happened. So I think saying that one erases the history of what we did to those folks, which is not good. And then there's also like an internal racism and otherism, which doesn't help because of the fact that we have our neighbor Haiti, which is mostly black,
Mhm.
and it allows us to other them as well. So I think it's one of the things that we have to battle the most in the DR. Is something I actively try to build bridges for, but it's very taboo here. A lot of folks still, don't accept that the reality is that we're mostly black, and that's okay. That culture also brings tons of value to who we are. At the same time, I do see progression in the right direction. Recently, there was a law that was passed that made it so that girls didn't have to like braid their hair to be in public school anymore, or have it in pigtail, like, or have it like in braid. They can just wear their hair natural. There's the acceptance of more of the music too. We have all these people always associate the DR with like merengue and salsa. Yes, those are also the ones that use the most Europeanized instruments.
Mhm.
Whereas bottles and all these other genres of music that use more like drum beats and African beats are not popularized, but they're starting to become more popular now and more accepted. Before we heard it, it'd be like, oh my God, that's like that's some catchy stuff. Now you hear like, oh no, that's cool. I like that. I like that. I like that beat. You think I kind of accepted in some circles. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but it's a long way to go. And it all comes down to a certain level of racism that we're seeing across the globe. When Dominicans look at TV and they see, or they look at pop culture and they see how blacks are treated around the world, they're like, oh, I don't want to be that.
And do you think that's where it stems from, or do you think there are long-standing racism, colorism, shadism happening that people have just continued adopting that?
I think it's both. I actually think it doesn't help the cause at all that what we highlight as our independence is independence from Haiti. So you automatically make them the other.
Mhm.
And they also happen to be black, for the most part. So I think that's probably like, I think if I was gonna give any advice to like historians or folks like, hey, like let's teach history a little different so that kids don't learn from the very beginning of school that we got our independence from our neighbors.
Yeah.
Rather, let's let's talk about the reality that was 400. They freed us from 300 years of oppression from the Spanish, and that we then realized when we went back to Spain that wasn't any better. We got independence from Spain. Let's highlight those things. But Spain is put on a pedestal, especially now with like Spain giving citizenship to more and more people from the diaspora. That's something people really want, because of the privilege it brings. So it's a tough battle.
Yeah, there is so much history that happened on that one island that is now two different countries that, like you said, the otherism with the people from Haiti and celebrating the independence from Haiti, when in fact, all of that wouldn't have happened had it not been for the colonization of the island unto itself.
Exactly. Exactly. And, there I talked to this historian a while back in training my staff because I run a tour operator and it's very important for our staff to like know the history so they can like when tourists ask. So and we try to give like not a sugar-coated version of history, So we had this historian come in and talk to our staff and something that he mentioned to us really at home was that, when Haiti came in, the DR people were mostly mixed already because they had been living up, like, it had been in the Lower County for hundreds of years.
Mhm.
And they were kind of welcome because, like, you're just like us. And the way that history is being told doesn't do justice to that. And it's frustrating.
I'd like to go over a couple of terms because I think you can probably help clear this up. You talked about indio, and when I was doing the research, indio and mestizo were being said as they were referring to the same mix. Would you say that's correct?
Uh, yes and no. So, I mean, the way it's used, yes. My mom would say she's indiecita. She had one vision, she just is like brown versus black. So I think they're used interchangeably. Indio should really, if you look at the definition, the word really should be like Indian or, indigenous because, Christian brothers started got to India. That's where India comes from. It's the word for India.
Some of the other terms that have come up is moreno.
Again, so funny. Moreno, like my brother's Moreno. He's black. But instead of saying black, they use Moreno. I was like, euphemism. It's brown, yeah. Negro would be like black, but Moreno's like brown, but going more towards black. Moreno and Indio still are used locally and frequently.
You mentioned Lebanese population. How and why did people from Lebanon get to the Dominican Republic?
I mean, you're stumping me there. Actually, I'm not super familiar with the history. I think it has something to do with the oil crisis in the 80s, though. But don't quote me on that.
That's just more research for me to do.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I'm constantly having to like. That's the thing about these kind of things. Like they don't teach it to you. You have to really seek it out because they're parts of history that are not part of like the majority of narrative.
Yeah.
So you really have to like find these little nuggets of information.
Absolutely. And, doing the research, what I'm finding is that there is what the research that's in the history books and the stories that are told are very often from one perspective. And to find the real answers, what's going on truly in the country, is a little bit harder to find, which is why I'm reaching out to people like you who can actually give me answers of what is the current culture like? What is the current cuisine like? And how does it feel for someone living there currently versus just reading the history?
Yeah, no, it's good. And something interesting about DR cuisine right now is that moving right now, the DR is one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America. We would say I hate these terms, but they're kind of going from being a developing country to being a developed country in some ways. So you're seeing that in the restaurant industry. We have our first missionary restaurant recently. I, Me and my wife and I went out to this restaurant over the weekend that called temporada or season, and it changes the menu every season for a different part of the world. So you're seeing like these different mixtures of food coming in that's affecting our local cuisine in some interesting ways. I had bun, yeah, they like Vietnamese bun that was goat and it's used with local oregano. It's interesting I'm curious to see what comes next. Especially right now, we have a big Venezuelan population coming in due to the crisis there.
Yeah.
So we're having arepas pop up and cachapas pop up, and like Dominicans are intermarrying with Venezuelans and something like that. That culture is mixing, and the foods are mixing. So it's going to be interesting to see what the next iteration ever is. We also have a huge and growing Chinese population. So our Chinatown is bustling now and they're really getting organized. So Sunday morning, there's a huge Chinatown market with like fresh fruit and vegetables and then all types of stalls with like all types of like dumplings and all types of Asian food. And now like show fan have become like a typical term here. Like people will make it at home with stir fried rice and that kind of stuff. So it's interesting to see how these things influence. The Chinatown is very, very beautiful with a really good Chinatown organization. The Dominican government has actually signed an agreement for tourism with China now as well too. So it's really interesting. Like I think I wouldn't see it given how different the cultures are, but allow most, one of the biggest conflicts is that most of the fried chicken places are now Chinese owned and they're the ones making most of the fried chicken here. So there's like a battle of who makes the best fried chicken.
I would raise my hand to say I'll come there and try them all and tell you what I think.
Yeah, whenever you want.
So as we wrap up, I want to mention that, for Canadians, which is, where I am, and maybe from the North American perspective, the Dominican Republic is a vacation spot, right? There are a ton of resorts, there are cruise ships that dock there, and it's not necessarily where people would tend to explore outside of the given tourist locations.
Yeah, yeah.
What do you think is important for a tourist or somebody considering visiting the Dominican to know about the country beyond the resort?
And you teed me up pretty good because that's exactly what we try to do. So at our company, we focus on ecotourism, and we focus on locally owned operations. So the DR is known for its beaches and the resorts and Punta Cana, but the reality is that we have the highest peak in the Caribbean. We have the microclimate. We have rainforest, cloud forest, waterfalls, all types of other beautiful things to see. So what we focus on is travel outside of the four walls of the resort. It's completely safe. We'll take you to beautiful places. You have all the comforts, same comforts. Just you might be in Samana and you might get to see humpback whale, or you might go to Los National Park and actually at an eco lodge. You might get to do a homestay with a family or something outside the boundaries of the resort. Because the biggest issue, I love a resort every once in a while. I'm not gonna knock down the resort, beautiful. But the problem is like the economic impact sometimes is not as good as it could be. A lot of the places are short owned. The benefits of travel don't stay in the community that you travel to. So what we try to do our offbeat is try to put as much of that economic benefit of travel with the people and the places that we're visiting. So by using locally owned lodges, locally owned restaurants, that kind of thing. We do things what we call leakage. So for anyone traveling to the Dominican, I would say like do the resort if you want to do a couple days of that, but do venture out. It's not dangerous outside the walls of the resort. There's a bunch of beautiful things to see. Santo Domingo is an amazing city with both a modern and historic sector that are both worth checking out. You have incredible mountains where you can do such like rafting, you can do kayaking, you can do hiking. There's so many things to do outside the work more than the resort. And yeah, like I think you definitely check those things out while you're here.
If people are interested in learning more about the Dominican Republic, um, would you say that reaching out to your company or looking at offbeat travel
Mhm.
is a good starting point?
Of course, yeah. You can always reach out. We're on offbeattravel.com. You can also check us on the Instagram, Offbeat Travel Experiences, or reach out to me, Harry at offbeattravel.com. I'm always available. Love to talk about the DR and kind of get people to see a different side of tourism. So yeah, definitely reach out if you have any questions or any thoughts.
Thank you so much, Harry, for sharing your knowledge of the DR, the region, the island as a whole with us today. We could probably talk a lot more about
Yeah,
all of the things.
it
We just don't have that much time, but I will leave all of the links in the show notes to reach out to Harry or look at the website and some of the other places that we talked about and other resources so you can get a full rounded view of the Dominican Republic beyond just a vacation spot. So thank you so much
Yes,
for
thank you
joining
so
me
much.
today. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Moreish Podcast. Connect with us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at the Moreish Podcast. See you for the next episode.